If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
The wind howled through the desolate back streets, whistling through rusted dumpsters and piles of discarded waste. It was late, past midnight, when the sound of weak, barely perceptible whimpers cut through the darkness. The noise was faint, so soft that it almost blended with the rattling of loose tin cans rolling along the pavement. But beneath the filth and decay of the garbage transfer station, something was alive. Something small, fragile, and on the brink of death. A matted skeletal figure curled into a tight ball amidst the refuse, barely distinguishable from the filth around him. His fur, once golden, was now a patchwork of dirt, dried blood, and tangled knots. His body trembled, not just from the cold but from exhaustion, pain, and something deeper, something primal, fear. He was too weak to move, too starved to stand, and too broken to hope. He had once been someone's dog, a living, breathing creature with love in his heart, with a wag in his tail, and a name he had long forgotten. But now, he was nothing. Less than nothing. A piece of trash, discarded and left to rot like the waste surrounding him. A car passed in the distance, its headlights briefly illuminating the filth-strewn alleyway. The sudden brightness revealed the true horror of the little dog's condition. His ribs jutted out in sharp angles beneath his mangy coat. His left ear was torn at the tip, and his back legs were tied together with a length of old rope, the knots cruelly tight, cutting into his already raw flesh. He had been dumped here deliberately, thrown away like unwanted garbage, left to suffer, to starve, to die. His stomach let out a low, painful growl. It had been days since he had eaten anything, and his body had long since begun consuming itself. But hunger was not his worst enemy. Humans were. He had learned that lesson the hard way. A few days ago, maybe a week, time had lost all meaning. He had crawled toward the main road, desperate for food, desperate for something, anything. A man had stopped his car, had stepped out, had crouched down and called to him. The dog had hesitated, his body shaking with both need and uncertainty. Then slowly he had taken a step forward, just one. And the man had kicked him, hard. The blow had sent his fragile body rolling onto the pavement. The laughter that followed had echoed in his ears, cruel and amused, before the man had spat at him and driven away. He had lain there for hours, his body too weak to move, his heart too broken to care. It was then that he realized no one was coming for him. No one would ever come for him. So when he heard the sound of approaching footsteps now, he didn't lift his head. He didn't move. He had given up. But the footsteps stopped, and then a voice, soft, uncertain, gentle. "Oh my God." The dog barely reacted. People had spoken to him before, but their voices had never meant kindness. A pair of boots crunched through the scattered debris. A figure knelt down. A human. A man, but different. There was no malice in his eyes, no cruelty in his voice. Just concern. The dog dared to glance up, his vision blurred from dehydration and exhaustion. The man was holding something. A small plastic container. He peeled back the lid, and a rich, meaty smell filled the air. Food. Real food. Not the rotting scraps he sometimes found buried in trash bags. Not the bitter, moldy bread he had once tried to eat out of desperation. This was fresh, warm, meant for a living being. The dog's nostrils flared, his stomach twisted with unbearable hunger. And yet he didn't move. What if it was a trick? He had been given food before. Tainted food, poisoned food. His body had burned with sickness, had twisted with agony. He had survived, but barely. The man placed the container on the ground and stepped back, keeping his hands raised as if to show he meant no harm. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured. "You don't have to be scared. I just want to help you." The dog didn't believe him, but the smell, God, the smell. Slowly, cautiously, he lifted his head. The movement was excruciating. Every muscle in his frail body screamed in protest. He dragged himself forward an inch, then another, his breathing ragged, his back legs useless behind him. The man didn't move, he just watched, waited. The dog's nose brushed against the rim of the container. Meat, rice, broth. He inhaled deeply, his mind a haze of hunger and hesitation. Then, finally, he ate. Not like a normal dog, not with the eager joy of a pet used to regular meals. He devoured the food like a starving animal, desperate, frantic, his jaw working furiously as he shoveled each bite into his mouth as quickly as he could. Because he didn't know when or if he would ever eat again. The man's throat tightened at the sight. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, voice hoarse. "What the hell happened to you?" But the dog wasn't listening. He was too busy surviving. The man sat there unmoving, watching as the frail creature tore through the meal like it might be his last. And maybe it would have been, but not anymore. Because for the first time in God knows how long, someone had seen him. And this time, they weren't going to leave him behind. The little dog ate like a creature that had never known kindness, his gaunt body trembling as he inhaled the food, shoveling into his mouth as though at any moment it might be ripped away. The man, still crouched at a respectful distance, could only watch in stunned silence. How long had this dog been starving? How many days, weeks, maybe months, had he spent fending for himself, picking through filth, enduring cruelty, and somehow clinging to life? The dog's ribs jutted out sharply beneath his skin, his fur a patchwork of filth, dried blood and open sores. This wasn't just neglect, this was suffering. This was injustice. Someone had done this to him. Someone had tossed him aside like garbage and left him to rot. The dog ate with such desperation that he began to choke, his frail body convulsing as he struggled to swallow too much too fast. The man instinctively moved forward, reaching out, but the second his hand extended, the dog flinched violently, his entire body recoiling as though expecting pain. The reaction cut deeper than a knife. "Jesus." The man's voice was barely above a whisper. What kind of life had this poor creature lived? The dog had stopped eating now, watching the man with terror-filled eyes, his small, emaciated frame tensed, prepared to bolt if the man moved too quickly. He didn't trust him. Not yet. The man forced himself to stay perfectly still. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, his voice as soft as he could make it. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The words meant nothing. The dog had heard words before, words followed by kicks, by blows, by thrown bottles and rocks. He took a cautious step back, his body trembling so violently that his legs nearly gave out beneath him. He was so weak, so painfully fragile, and yet he was still trying to run. The injustice of it all filled the man's chest with a raw, burning fury. Who could do this? Who could take a living, breathing creature and break it so completely? But now wasn't the time for anger. Now was the time for patience. The man reached into his pocket, retrieving another small piece of food. A soft strip of chicken. He didn't move closer, didn't try to force the dog to take it. Instead, he simply placed it on the ground between them and leaned back, giving the animal space. "Here," he said gently, "it's yours if you want it." The dog did want it. His nose twitched, his eyes flicking between the food and the man. He was starving, but terrified. Minutes passed in silence. The dog didn't move, the man didn't either. Then finally, the dog took a tiny, hesitant step forward, then another, and he ate. The man exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The dog's body was still tense, still wary, but he hadn't run. He had taken food from a human's hand, maybe for the first time in his life. It was the smallest of victories, but a victory nonetheless. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" the man said softly, a faint smile ghosting his lips. The dog didn't react to his voice. He was already retreating again, curling back into his pathetic little nest of filth. The exhaustion was catching up to him, his frail body shivering as the cold wind bit through his dirty, thinning fur. The man's chest ached. He couldn't leave him here. He wouldn't. But how the hell was he going to get this broken little creature to trust him enough to come? The dog had been betrayed by humans before. He had every reason to fear them. And yet, he had taken the food. He had stayed. There was hope. A fragile, flickering hope. The man sat back on the pavement, adjusting his posture, making himself look smaller, less intimidating. He wasn't going anywhere, not until the dog did. And for the first time in who knows how long, neither was alone. The night stretched long and cold, the sky a thick, oppressive darkness above the garbage station. The stray curled into himself, his frail body barely visible against the filthy, torn trash bags that had become his home. His breath came in shallow, uneven huffs, exhaustion pulling at his limbs, but his mind wouldn't let him sleep. He was used to this feeling, the feeling of being hunted. Not long ago, before he ended up here, he had belonged to someone. At least, that's what they called it. Ownership. But ownership had meant pain. Ownership had meant chains that cut into his neck, sharp kicks to his ribs when he didn't cower fast enough, nights left shivering in the rain with no food, no warmth, no kindness. He had tried to please them. God. He had tried. But it was never enough. He was never enough. And one day they had decided they were done with him. They had driven him to the outskirts of town, the metal cage rattling in the back of the truck, the smell of rust and old blood filling his nose. He had whined, pawed at the bars, hoping, begging, that maybe this time they weren't angry. Maybe this time they'd bring him back inside. Then the truck stopped. The hands that had once chained him now grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and threw him out. Hard pavement slammed into his ribs. The impact stole his breath. He scrambled to his feet, dazed, confused, panicked, and then the engine roared. He ran. He ran until his paws were raw and bleeding, until his legs trembled with exhaustion, until he could no longer see the truck's taillights disappearing into the horizon. They were gone. They had abandoned him. That had been months ago. Now he knew better than to trust. And yet tonight a man had come, not to hurt him, not to chase him away, but to feed him. He should have ignored it. He should have kept hiding. But the hunger was too much. His body betrayed him, and for the first time in a long time, he had eaten a meal without fear. But the man was still here, sitting, watching, waiting. He didn't understand. Why hadn't he left? Most people just threw scraps and walked away. No one stayed. No one looked at him like they cared. But this man? He wasn't leaving. The dog curled in tighter, his muscles locking up with tension. This was wrong. This wasn't how it worked. He didn't want to believe in kindness again. He couldn't. Because if he did, and if it turned out to be a lie, the betrayal would kill him. The man sat with his back against a cracked concrete wall, his legs stretched out in front of him, his breath coming out in faint puffs in the night air. He had been here for hours now, unmoving, waiting. The dog wasn't ready. Not yet. He had seen that look before, the haunted, hollow stare of an animal who had been beaten down, who had been discarded like trash, who had learned that humans meant pain, not love. But he wasn't going to give up on him. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his bag and pulled out a thick, soft blanket. The little dog flinched at the movement, his sunken eyes locked onto the man's hands, expecting a blow. But none came. Instead, the man unfolded the blanket and gently placed it on the ground between them. "I won't take you yet," the man murmured, his voice soft. "I just want you to be warm." The dog's ears twitched. He didn't move. The man leaned back again, careful not to push. This had to be the dog's choice. Minutes passed, then an hour. And then finally, a shift. The dog moved, just barely. First a cautious sniff of the blanket, then an even slower step forward. His ribs stretched beneath his thin coat, his frail legs trembling with each movement. He hesitated. Doubt, fear, memories of hands that had hurt him before. But the cold was biting, and the blanket smelled safe. A deep, shuddering breath left the dog's nose. Then, cautiously, he stepped onto the blanket and curled up on top of it, his body still taut with tension, but no longer shivering. The man swallowed the lump in his throat. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a start. He wouldn't rush this, wouldn't force it. The dog needed time, and for the first time in who knows how long, someone was willing to give it to him. The sun rose sluggishly over the town, its pale golden light stretching across the cracked pavement of the garbage station. The morning air was crisp, the kind that stung the lungs with every inhale. The dog remained curled on the blanket, his body stiff, his eyes half-lidded in exhaustion, but sleep had not come easy. Fear still had its claws in him. Even after last night, even after the food, even after the warmth of the blanket beneath him, he couldn't bring himself to believe this was real. Nothing good ever lasted. The man was still here. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that the dog could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. He sat on the edge of the garbage station, his back against a rusted dumpster, his eyes soft but unwavering. He had stayed the entire night. The dog didn't understand why. Humans had never stayed before. Humans never waited for anything. What did he want? The man didn't speak right away. He knew better than to rush things. Trust wasn't given, it was earned. Instead, he pulled a sandwich from his bag, unwrapped it, and took a slow bite, making sure the dog could see him. No sudden movements, no threats, just patience. Then, carefully, he reached into the bag again and pulled out a small piece of cooked chicken, setting it gently on the pavement between them. The dog's ears flicked, his nose twitched, but he didn't move. He wanted to. God, He wanted to. His stomach still ached from hunger, but his mind screamed at him to stay still, to be careful, to survive. The man sighed. "Take your time, buddy." His voice was low, quiet, steady, not a command, not a demand, just an invitation. The dog didn't believe in words, but something about this one felt different. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of the man sitting there, waiting, letting the morning roll past in a haze of shifting light and scattered dust. But then, movement, a single step forward, then another. The dog crept toward the piece of chicken, his legs trembling, his thin frame casting a shadow that barely looked like it belonged to a living creature. His ribs jutted out beneath his ragged coat, his paws sore and cracked from walking on broken glass and gravel. He stopped, hesitated. Then finally, he lowered his head, snatched the food into his mouth, and immediately leapt back, as if waiting for punishment, as if waiting for the pain that always followed something good. But nothing happened. No kick, no yelling, no chains, just silence. The man exhaled slowly, his heart breaking at the sight of the dog fling from a kindness he didn't understand. "Good boy," he murmured. The dog's ears flicked at the sound, but his body remained stiff. The man reached into his bag again, pulled out another piece of chicken, and set it down a little closer this time. The dog's gaze darted between the food and the man's face, calculating, analyzing, wondering. Could he trust this? Could he trust him? The war waged inside the dog's mind was visible in every twitch of his muscles, every slight shudder of hesitation. Then, finally, a step forward. The dog took the food. But this time he didn't jump back. By the afternoon, he was eating directly from the man's hand. Still cautious, still flinching at the smallest movement, but the barrier was breaking. The man smiled. This was progress. But he knew the real challenge hadn't even begun. Because earning a dog's trust was one thing. Convincing him to leave the only home he'd ever known, that was another battle entirely. The late afternoon sun bathed the garbage station in a burnt orange glow, casting long shadows across the rusted metal and piles of discarded waste. The air smelled of rotting food and oil-soaked cardboard, a scent so deeply embedded in the filth that even the strongest winds couldn't carry it away. And yet this was home. For all its cruelty, for all its filth and danger, this was the only place the dog had ever known. It was the only place where he had survived. So when the man, his man, rose to his feet and gestured toward the street, an unspoken invitation in his quiet patience, the dog froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. Leave? He couldn't leave. His mind screamed at him to run back to the piles of garbage, to the shadows, to the only security he had ever known. Because safety wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about warmth or kindness. Safety was about predictability. And stepping outside this boundary meant surrendering to the unknown. And the unknown had never been kind. The man saw the shift in the dog's posture, the way his body stiffened, the way his tail, once flicking with the tiniest glimmer of hope, now curled beneath him. He was scared. Of course he was. The man sighed, crouching back down to the dog's level, letting his presence remain constant. "I know, buddy," he murmured. "I get it." Because he did. He had seen it before. This war between fear and hope, with abused dogs, with abandoned souls, with people too. Fear was a chain, and even when the lock was broken, the weight of it remained. "I won't force you," the man said softly, "but I'm not leaving without you." The dog's ears twitched, his gaze flicking between the man and the path beyond the station, the road he had never dared to cross, the world beyond the rusted walls that had been both his prison and his shelter. Then, without warning, the dog whimpered, a soft, broken sound that barely made it past his throat, the kind of sound that spoke of a soul torn apart too many times. The man reached out, slowly. His fingers hovered just above the dog's sunken head. The dog flinched, but he didn't run. That was enough. The man's hand lowered, fingertips grazing fur for the first time. It was coarse, matted with dirt, riddled with scars. The dog's body trembled beneath the touch, as if expecting the pain that always followed human contact. But pain never came. Instead, gentleness, a warmth that seeped through the dog's hollow chest, curling around his bones like something unfamiliar, something terrifying, something called kindness. The man didn't move. He let the dog feel. He let him decide. And finally, with the kind of hesitation that spoke of heartbreak and hesitation, of longing and terror intertwined, the dog took a step forward, then another, and another. until the garbage station, the filth, the rusted walls, they were behind him, and for the first time, he stepped into the unknown. The road was uneven beneath the dog's hesitant steps, every inch of pavement foreign against his battered paws. His body remained low, his movements wary, muscles coiled as if expecting the world to strike him down at any moment. But the man never hurried him. He simply walked a few steps ahead, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos of a world the dog had never dared to trust. Cars rushed past, their roaring engines sending jolts of terror through the stray's thin frame. He flinched at every honk, every sudden burst of noise, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. But he kept walking, because for the first time someone was waiting for him to follow. The man's house was small, modest, the kind of place that whispered of quiet solitude rather than grand gestures. But to the dog, it was overwhelming. The walls loomed too high, nothing like the open sky he had known. The door seemed too solid, as if it could trap him inside. And when the man opened it and gestured him forward, the dog hesitated. His ribs ached from malnutrition, his legs weak from years of neglect, but this was the hardest step yet. He had never entered a home before, not once. Homes belonged to other dogs, to loved dogs, not to him. Never to him. But then the scent. It drifted from inside, warmth, food, something soft, something safe. And for all his fear, his doubt, his desperate need to keep the world at a distance, his hunger won. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No honking cars, no clattering trash cans, no human voices yelling in disgust, shooing him away like vermin. Just stillness. A soft hum from somewhere deep inside the house, a low, unfamiliar peace. The dog's paws remained planted on the doormat. His heart hammered against his ribs, his breath uneven. He wasn't supposed to be here. Homes had rules. He didn't know the rules. If he broke them, would the man throw him back out? Would he be punished? Would it be worse than the streets? The man didn't push, didn't demand, didn't try to drag him inside. He simply crouched again, his expression unreadable. "I know you don't trust this yet," he said softly, "but you can." The dog didn't believe him. Not yet. But he wanted to. Oh God, he wanted to. The warmth of the house wrapped around him like something forbidden. He kept to the edges, avoiding the middle of the room. He sniffed at the floor, testing the air, his body taut with uncertainty. And then the blanket, folded in the corner, thick, soft. It wasn't the sharp metal of a cage. It wasn't the cold pavement. It wasn't the filth of a garbage pile. It was his. The dog's legs shook beneath him as he lowered himself, curling tightly against the fabric. His body remained stiff, his ears flicking toward every unfamiliar sound, but he didn't move away. Didn't bolt, didn't run back to the door. He stayed, and for the first time, the weight in his chest didn't feel like fear. It felt like something else, something fragile, something like hope. The night was long and uncertain. The dog barely slept. Every shift in the air, every creak in the walls, every distant hum of passing cars sent jolts of unease through his frail body. His ears twitched constantly, his muscles remained tense beneath the warmth of the blanket. He had never known silence like this. It wasn't the emptiness of an abandoned lot or the eerie quiet of a shelter after dark. It was different. Soft. Too soft. His ribs rose and fell in uneven breaths, his mind stuck in an endless cycle of doubt. He had learned long ago that comfort was a trick, that food came with a price, that kindness was the start of something cruel. But then, morning came, and everything was still okay. The scent of food stirred him from his cautious half-sleep. His stomach twisted, a dull, relentless ache reminding him of every night he had spent scavenging for scraps. The man was at the kitchen counter, moving slow, deliberate. He hadn't spoken yet, hadn't forced the dog to do anything. Instead, he placed something on the floor. A bowl. Warm, fresh, real food. The dog's limbs locked up. This was where the trap came. The price. The test. In the streets, food was always fought for, stolen, ripped away. If he moved too fast, it could be snatched from him. If he hesitated too long, someone might decide he didn't deserve it. But the man stepped back, didn't touch the bowl again, didn't demand anything in return. Just waited. The dog's throat burned with hunger, but his body was paralyzed. What if it wasn't real? What if it disappeared the second he reached for it? What if he was punished for taking it? Minutes passed. The hunger won. It always won. He inhaled the food in frantic, desperate bites, his body curled around the bowl protectively, shielding it as if someone would come and rip it away at any second. His teeth scraped against the bottom, his chest heaving, his paws trembling from the force of his own urgency. But no one stopped him, no one grabbed him, no one raised their voice. By the time he was done, his stomach felt fuller than it had in months, and for the first time the ache wasn't from hunger. The days that followed were a delicate routine. The man never moved too quickly, never reached for the dog without warning, never expected too much at once. The dog watched everything, every movement, every gesture, waiting for the moment it all turned against him. But it never did. Instead, the man gave him space. Left the door open when he moved between rooms, let the dog choose where he wanted to be. He didn't trap him, didn't command him, didn't punish him when he flinched away. It didn't make sense. Humans always wanted something. So what did this one want? Why was he waiting? What was the catch? But then the first touch happened. A small, hesitant brush of fingers against the dog's head. The dog froze. Every muscle went rigid. His instincts screamed at him to pull away, to run, to protect himself. But the touch was gentle. Just a second. And then it was gone. The man didn't push, didn't demand, just let him decide. The dog's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his body locked in place, his thoughts tangled in ways they had never been before. He didn't understand. This wasn't normal. But maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be. That night, for the first time since entering the house, the dog let himself sleep. Not just the restless, half-aware dozing of survival. A real sleep. A sleep where his body wasn't coiled in fear, where his ears didn't twitch at every sound, where the warmth of the blanket beneath him felt safe. And when he woke, the man was still there, still patient, still waiting. And for the first time, the dog thought that maybe, just maybe, he wanted to stay. The days turned to weeks, and the dog, who had once flinched at every sound, who had once cowered at the sight of an outstretched hand, began to change. Not all at once. Not in a way that was sudden or easy, but slowly, painfully, hesitantly. He started to believe. It wasn't something the dog had ever known before, at least not in a way that lasted. He had been hurt too many times, left too many times. Every bit of kindness he had once dared to accept had been followed by cruelty, by betrayal, by a reminder that he didn't deserve it. So why was this different? Why hadn't the man given up on him yet? Why hadn't he been thrown back onto the streets, discarded like he had been before? The man never forced anything. He never rushed the dog, never tried to own him. He just let him be. And somehow that was worse than punishment, because it made the dog want to believe in something again. And that was terrifying. The first time he took a step forward, on his own, was a quiet moment. The man was sitting on the couch, reading. The house was calm, the kind of calm the dog still wasn't used to. He was watching, always watching, not from fear, but because a part of him wanted to understand. And then, without thinking, he moved. Just a single step, then another. The man didn't look up, didn't react, just let the dog choose. And finally, the dog closed the distance. Slowly, he lowered his head, pressing his cold nose against the man's knee. It was small, barely anything. But to the dog, it was everything. And when the man finally raised his hand, resting it gently on the dog's head, there was no flinch, no fear, just warmth, just something new, something the dog had never let himself hope for before. That was the moment it changed. Not all at once, not in a way that was sudden or easy, but in a way that mattered. Because now, when the man moved, the dog followed. When the man left a door open, the dog walked through it. When the man sat down, the dog curled beside him, no longer afraid of the weight of his own existence. It wasn't perfect. Some nights, the nightmares still came. Some days, the ghosts of his past were too loud, too heavy, too present. But for the first time, he wasn't fighting them alone. And that was something. That was everything. But then the past came back. It always did. Because the world wasn't fair. Because injustice didn't disappear just because you found a place to feel safe. Because some people, some monsters, never stopped looking for what they had lost. And the man who had once hurt him, who had abandoned him, was coming back. The dog didn't know how, didn't know why, but he could sense it. The way his body still remembered the scent of danger. The way his ears perked at the sound of a truck stopping just a little too long outside the house. The way the man stiffened when he looked at his phone, his jaw tightening in a way the dog had never seen before. Something was coming. And for the first time in his life, the dog wasn't the one who wanted to run. He was the one who wanted to fight. The night was heavy with the weight of an unseen presence. The air inside the house was warm, but a deep, bone-chilling cold seeped in through the windows. Outside, a lone street lamp flickered against the darkness, casting long shadows across the porch. The dog, now stronger, his fur thick with health, his ribs no longer pressing against his skin, sat by the door, his ears perked, his body tense. He smelled something. Someone. The man noticed it too. For weeks, life had been peaceful. The dog had learned to wag his tail when he saw his owner, had learned that hands could be gentle, not just fists. He had even started playing, chasing after a worn-out tennis ball in the yard, hesitating at first, but eventually bounding after it with cautious excitement. But something had shifted in the air tonight. The man could feel it, the same way the dog could. Then it happened. A car, its engine low and menacing, rolled to a stop outside. The headlights flicked off, leaving only the dull red glow of taillights barely illuminating the pavement. The dog's body went rigid, his breath hitched. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his throat, a sound of warning, of recognition. The man stepped closer to the window, peering out. A figure stood just beyond the porch, their silhouette dark and unmoving. The street lamp cast just enough light for the man to see the unmistakable stance of someone who had come with intent. And then, the voice. "You got my dog." The words slithered through the night, oily and thick. The voice was deep, familiar. A voice that the dog, who had once lived in terror, would never forget. The man clenched his jaw, his hands curled into fists. The dog let out another growl, his body lowering, his hackles rising. The man stepped out onto the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You lost him the moment you left him to die in the trash," he said, his voice steel. "He's not yours anymore." The man in the shadows stepped forward into the pale light. His face was rough, lined with anger and arrogance. His hands twitched at his sides, his boots crunching against the gravel as he took a slow step closer. "That ain't for you to decide," the stranger said, his voice dripping with mockery. "He's mine, always has been." Inside, the dog stood at the door, his body trembling, not with fear, but with something else. Determination. For so long, he had cowered, had shrunk himself down to nothing, had flinched at every shadow, had obeyed every cruel command. But not anymore. His new owner, the man who had saved him, stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. The stranger's sneer deepened, his hand twitching toward something in his jacket. The man on the porch saw it, a knife. His body tensed, but before he could react, the dog moved. Like a bolt of lightning, he lunged. Teeth bared, a growl tearing through the night. He leapt through the open door and onto the porch, landing between his owner and the man who had once beaten him into submission. His stance was wide, his tail high, his chest rising and falling with heavy, defiant breaths. And then, he barked. Not a whimper, not a growl. A bark that shattered the night. A bark that claimed his place. For the first time in his life, he was standing up for himself. For the first time, he wasn't running away. The stranger took a step back. Just a small one, but enough. Enough for the man standing behind the dog to see what he needed to see. This wasn't a helpless animal anymore. This wasn't the same weak, trembling dog that had been left in the trash to die. This was a dog who had found something worth fighting for. The stranger's lips curled in disgust. He spat onto the ground. "This ain't over," he said. Then he turned, walked back to his car, and drove off into the night. Silence. The man let out a slow breath, his hands still clenched, his pulse still racing. Then he looked down. The dog was still standing there, still watching the road where the car had disappeared. His whole body was tense, his breath quick. The man knelt beside him, pressing a hand against his strong back. "You did good, boy," he whispered, "real good." The dog turned, looking up at him with those same deep, soulful eyes. But for the first time, there was something new in them. Not fear, not doubt, but pride. The night's tension lingered long after the stranger had disappeared down the road. The man locked every door, checked every window, his hands still shaking from the confrontation. The dog sat beside him, his body still stiff, his eyes locked on the door, as if expecting the past to come crashing back through at any moment. The man crouched down, running a hand along the dog's back, feeling the taut muscles beneath his thickening fur. "It's over," he murmured, or though he knew it wasn't. The dog didn't relax, neither did the man. Somewhere deep inside, they both knew the stranger would come back. The following days were a strange mix of peace and anticipation. The dog continued his progress, growing stronger, more confident. He played in the yard, learned to sit and stay with a new ease, even curled up at his owner's feet at night. But there was always a shadow lingering at the edges of his mind, a wound that had not yet fully healed. The man saw it in the way the dog still flinched at certain sounds: boots crunching against gravel, the distant rumble of an approaching car, the way his ears perked up every time the wind shifted, as if waiting for something unseen to return. And the man felt it too, the weight of the unspoken truth, that peace could not last unless they confronted what was still hunting them. And so he prepared, not just for himself, but for the dog who had learned to fight. For the dog who had earned the right to be safe. It happened late at night, just as the man knew it would. The sound of an engine rolling down the road, then stopping. The headlights clicked off. The dog was already awake, his body coiled like a spring, his ears perked, his breath sharp and alert. The man grabbed the shotgun from beneath the couch. No more games. This time, he would not let the past steal back what it had tried to destroy. Outside, the porch creaked beneath the weight of heavy boots. A voice, low, mocking. "You thought you could just keep him?" The man stood by the door, the gun held steady. His heart pounded, but his voice remained calm. "He's not yours." A bitter chuckle. "He was never yours to take." Inside, the dog's body trembled, not with fear but with something more powerful. A fire had been lit inside him, something fierce and unbreakable. He would not hide. He would not cower. He would stand. Because this was his home now. Because he had found something stronger than pain. He had found love. The man outside took another step forward, a glint of metal in his hand. But this time, he was met with something he didn't expect. Not just the man's unwavering gaze, but the growl from the dog beside him. Low, deep, deadly. The stranger hesitated. For the first time, he saw what had changed. This was no longer the same broken animal he had left to die. This was a warrior. And he was no longer afraid. "Leave," the man said, his voice sharp as steel. "Or you won't walk away this time." The stranger stared at the dog, at the fire burning behind his eyes. And then he took a step back, then another, until finally he turned and walked away. The car engine roared to life. The taillights flickered once, then vanished into the night, and just like that, the past was gone. The man let out a long, slow breath. He turned to the dog, who still stood tall, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. "You saved me." "No, you saved yourself." The man knelt, running a hand through the thick fur of the dog's neck, pulling him close. "You're free now, boy," he whispered. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." And for the first time, the dog, who had spent his life waiting for a blow, for cruelty, for betrayal, leaned into the touch, not with fear, but with trust, with love. And as the first light of dawn broke across the sky, the man and his dog stood together on the porch, watching a world that, for the first time, belonged to them both. Because this was not the end. This was only the beginning.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.